Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled Alien Property. My name is Nadia Lali. I'm the director for the Center of Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And the event today is co-sponsored by the Center for Middle East Studies and the Watson Institute at Brown University. I'm really pleased to be hosting the event today, but it really came about as a result of a research project by an undergraduate student, Emily Teng. Emily is a rising senior concentrating in international relations and applied math. She is interested in the intersection of law and cultural heritage repatriation and is passionate about building a conversation and introducing more diverse narratives in museums. Emily will be in conversation today with the artist Rayyane Tabet and curators Kim Benzel and Clare Davies, and they will be discussing primarily the exhibition Alien Property by Rayyane Tabet. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand it over to Emily.
Thank you, Professor Al-Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'm honored to be introducing and co-moderating a conversation on alien property, a project that engages with the story of the 9th century BC stone reliefs excavated in the early 20th century at Tell Halaf, Syria, and their subsequent destruction, loss, or dispersal to the museum collections around the world. The exhibition, curated by Kim Benzel, Clare Davies, tells the journey of these stone reliefs and artist Rayyane Tabet's personal connection to them. It is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art until June 2021. This afternoon, we have invited the curators and artists that have made this exhibition possible. Kim Benzel is the curator in charge of the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she has worked on numerous exhibitions and related publications since starting her career at the museum in 1990. Clare Davies is an assistant curator in the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, who joined the Met in 2015 as the museum's first curator of modern and contemporary art from the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. And of course, Rayyane Tabet is an artist who lives and works between Beirut and San Francisco. Drawing from experience and self-directed research, Tabet explores stories that offer an alternative understanding of major social political events through individual narrators. I first encountered this project when I connected with Kim through a workshop hosted by the Brown Summer Institute last summer. Our conversation inspired me to look deeper into our narratives around object histories and question what decolonization means for museums. It has also prompted me to continue this dialogue at the university. And my hope is for this afternoon's conversation to be a starting point for students like myself to rethink object histories and our perspectives on cultural institutions like museums. And to that end, I would like to thank the 3 panelists for joining me and the Center of Middle East Studies for making this conversation possible. For viewers on Zoom and YouTube, you can also submit questions for the panelists through the chat function, and we will be reviewing them in the later half of the conversation. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kim, Clare, and Rayyane. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I guess to start us off with the conversation, for those who haven't seen the exhibition in person, would each of you briefly set the stage of Alien Property? And Rayyane, maybe you can start on what inspired you to create this project in 2016, I believe.
Sure. Hi, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for the help organizing and moderating this. Yeah, so in 2016, actually, I moved from Beirut to Berlin to do a 1-year artist residency with the DAAD there. And at the time, I thought it was maybe a good opportunity because of a long kind of sustained engagement in one place to look at actually what had been for a very long time kind of more of a family mystery. So I had kind of grown up in Beirut and had always heard of this figure called Max von Oppenheim in kind of, my mother's family, like dinners and lunches. And it's because my great-grandfather, Faik Burgos, had worked with Max von Oppenheim in 1929 at the in Tell Halaf, at the site of the dig where subsequently I learned that a lot of these objects that were dispersed came from. And so when I moved to Berlin, I thought that maybe it was a good opportunity to kind of actually because, you know, beyond, let's say, a family myth, not much was known of kind of Max von Oppenheim and his engagement in Syria. And so I thought it would be an interesting kind of point of departure for research, because kind of that's how I work and how, you know, my process goes. And so soon after arriving to Berlin, I met with Nadia Kolidis and Lutz Martin, who are two curators and conservators at the Pergamon Museum, who had worked extensively on the finds from Tell Halaf and knew a lot about Max von Oppenheim. And so I kind of like approached them, let's say, much more personally, telling them, you know, that I'm the kind of descendant of somebody who had worked on this dig, and if I could, you know, just kind of meet with them and talk to them about it. And then through them, I was introduced to this kind of complex and complicated story of Tell Halaf, of the dig, of what happened to these objects, their dispersal, their dissemination, their destruction in and out of their site. And so I, you know, suddenly I found myself, you know, in the middle of this story. And through them, I was actually introduced, I learned that there was this kind of, let's say, a frieze in the back of the Tell Halaf, you know, one of the major, moments of the Tell Halaf excavation was kind of the discovery of a palace, the back of which had let's say, a frieze made out of about 200 stone slabs that had been, over the course of a century, disseminated across 7 museums. And so I kind of went about identifying these institutions and trying to contact people working there to see if I could be given just access to these objects and maybe, you know, do something with them. And so it's through Nadia and Lutz that I was actually introduced to Kim, who I kind of came to visit in August of 2016 at the Met, again with a similar premise, you know, not immediately saying that maybe I'm an artist, saying that I'm the descendant of somebody who had worked on a dig, some of the objects of which are in their collection. And I think, you know, the conversation grew organically from there. So it's important to kind of preface this by saying that this was not, I would like a traditional exhibition invitation, right? That it was kind of, it grew out of conversations, out of discoveries, out of accidents, as opposed to kind of like a work that was already set, that I had already made, let's say the works in the studio, and that we were kind of like looking for venues. And I think it's an important and a distinction that I think transformed the way even institutions engaged with me personally, but also with the project in general. So I'll maybe, hand it over to Kim, and who can then transition us into how this became an exhibition, and then Claire can help us.
We're going chronologically. Thanks, Rayyane, and thank you. I want to add my thanks to Emily for inviting us and for staying so engaged and interested with the project of Alien Property. It was a pleasure to work with you last summer, and it's a continued pleasure to still be in touch and engaged. And also thank you to Professor Alali and Barbara and Ellen for making all this possible. So picking up where Rayyane just left off, I will also add that the specific request, Rayyane, at the time when you came, was if you could make graphite rubbings of our reliefs. So it was a very specific request. And of course, in the course of that conversation and why, it was interesting beyond just a yes or no conservation answer. We had this remarkable discussion, and I learned about this personal history of Rayyane's family, the extent I knew from Nadia and Lutz in Berlin that he had been there for a while and had sort of, gotten really immersed in their collection of Tell Halaf. And, but it was just a really wonderful series of conversations that you and I, Rayyane, had then for a while. And what, lots to say on that topic, but what struck me beyond, we pulled in our conservator who gave approval for Rayyane to do graphite rubbings of 3 of the 4 reliefs, because 3 are basalt and very sturdy and could be rubbed. The 4th one is limestone and more friable, and was not given, he was not given approval. And that goes throughout all these institutions. No one in any of the institutions allowed you to rub the limestone ones. And happy to talk about, there's a really wonderful interplay in the archaeological site of limestone and basalt. So it was very colorful, in fact, in antiquity. So Rayyane was given permission to make the rubbings, but what attracted me to the story, and which led me to then go to Clare, and for all of us to start discussing, what else is possible besides just saying, go ahead, Rayyane, and then, good luck, was that for us in the Department of Ancient Near East, which I will immediately call out as a name that is being discussed very actively as a name for the department and the collection. Stay tuned, it is being changed, I'm not sure when, on the topic of decolonizing. It's important to note that. What was really compelling for us in our department was that we have long known the story, the history, the various histories of Tell Halaf and its objects, their dispersals, their destruction, the various entanglements that the site has had from antiquity all the way up until still today, most recently at the hands of Rayyane himself. And it's a fascinating, sort of story of object biographies. And it also goes deeply into all the sort of issues of colonialism, imperialism, safekeeping of objects, where they're safe, where they're not. The site itself and its story troubles so many of the narratives that we have learned in school and inherited from our academic backgrounds. And so it's a complicated story. And for us at the Met, the sort of final phase is that our reliefs came through this really crazy route of the Alien Property Custodian, which we can talk more about. So we, in our department, siloed as an ancient department with our 4 reliefs, the only way we ever had to really tell that full story and that very complicated, complex, and tangled story was if we showed our 4 reliefs and then, put an enormous amount of words on a wall. What immediately became clear as a possibility to me in speaking with Rayyane was this was the way we could tell that story and actually make it a visual one and an even, more compelling one. And so with that, I went to Clare because at the time, I know a little bit more about contemporary art right now, thanks to Clare and Rayyane. But at the time I didn't. I don't know Rayyane. I didn't know Rayyane as an artist. Turns out he's quite famous. I didn't know his work. I don't know if it's good or bad. So Clare was instrumental in then sort of coming in and being that, that third leg. And I think I'll pass to you, Clare, but it was really that conversation between the 3 of us that normally, Clare speaks to artists all the time. I don't often, I know Clare, but I don't often work with her. It was really that sort of intersection of backgrounds and thinking that led to where we are. So I'll pass to you, Clare.
Thank you, Kim. And again, a quick thank you to Emily, Professor Alali, and Barbara, who done such a wonderful job in setting this up. And I think that really what I've realized over the course of this exhibition being up is how much it is a platform for discussion, and that's what we're doing today. And so thank you for that. So Kim came to me and had this, she was very excited, and she said, I've just met this artist who has this fascinating way of engaging the collection. And so I got really excited about the project for various reasons. One, I knew Rayyane and I knew his work. And I thought this would be a fantastic idea because he's such an interesting artist in that he takes these stories from history that are almost truer than fiction and creates out of them sculptures, installations, performances. He kind of gives them a life in the world that we inhabit today. And they stand as independent works of art, of course, but they also serve as this portal into a really fascinating moments in history. But the other thing that I thought was extremely compelling was the way in which Rayyane's project intersected with Kim's project. And Kim's project, as I understood it, has been, they're in the process of rethinking how to install the galleries and how to present this body of work from the past. And I won't speak for you, Kim, I'll just sort of mention it for now. But in this current moment that we live in a so-called encyclopedic museum like the Met, and thinking through a lot of the sticky questions associated with ancient artifacts, their display, and their collection. And this exhibition gave an opportunity for me to be part of that. And for that, I was very thankful. And I think, that's the conversation I want to be having. And also that's partly what I think that the opportunity is for somebody like me, who's a modern contemporary person, being in a museum with colleagues who work on the ancient world. And so all of those aspects of the project are really exciting. And then the way it developed, and I think Kim and Rayyane have sort of indicated this, is it really came about as a conversation, and that was really wonderful to work in that way outside of the usual framework of a museum where you have the curator and the artist, very distinct roles. And yeah, I'll stop there, but I think that I could go on, but we'll get to other parts of the exhibition in a moment. So.
Yeah, I've heard of the collaboration process, and it really fascinates me how the three of you managed to interact and collaborate so well on this project. But I wanted to sort of take a step back and maybe go over a bit on like the history of these stone reliefs for our viewers who might not be really familiar with it, and also maybe go over, maybe we could have also a visual for the rubbings that Rayyane has made for these reliefs, so we could have a bit better visual aid to see what we're talking about. But yeah, to provide some context, could you guys talk about the history of these reliefs and how some of them ended up in the Met?
I suppose I should do that since they're in our department. Claire, actually, would you mind starting with the ancient reliefs for 2 seconds? So, we'll go from, I think we have some good images of them. Those are them in situ at, in the exhibition. Do you have individual images of them so they're a little bit clearer? Yeah, so we'll do one at a time. So yeah, they've been in our collection since 1943, and they came to us in a very unusual way. I mean, the provenance of objects, of ancient objects, is a dissertation or 20 or 100,000, in and of themselves. So, that is something that, as Claire mentioned, we are very, in our department, I'm not going to speak for the entire Met, in our department, deeply engaged with provenance and interrogating everything. We have the only dedicated provenance researcher in the building, has been embedded with us for about 10 years, 9-10 years, and done Vaturi, and all our provenance is online on our web, on our object pages. And so, as I had mentioned earlier, the provenance of these 4 reliefs, and Claire, if you want to cycle through if you have the other ones, that would be great, but if you don't, that's fine too. They came to us through something called the Office of the Alien Property Custodian, which in and of itself is exactly as creepy as it sounds, known as the APC. It was initially a World War I office that was established during World War I. It was a sort of a component of the Trading with the Enemy Act. And basically, the Alien Property Custodian was given the power to, and I'm going to read from the actual act, it was created to assume control and dispose of enemy-owned property in the United States in his possessions. And as such, they could seize property, which is included bank accounts and other properties, but it also included things in storehouses and warehouses. And they could, and again I quote, they could hold, use, administer, liquidate, sell, or otherwise deal with in the interest of and for the benefit of the United States. And that is exactly what they did with 8 of the reliefs from Tell Halaf. Now, the background to why they were in this warehouse in New York at Hahn Brothers Storage in 1943, when the APC seized them, was that our friend, introduced by Rayyane, Baron Max von Oppenheim, who was the excavator of the site, an amateur excavator, I would add, but he did publish the site. At one point, there's a long history to it, which I don't know if we have time to or want to go into, but by 1930, the excavations had sort of, stopped and started and stopped and started. They under the Ottomans, and then continued under the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. By 1930, a lion's share of the site of the material culture from the site had ended up in Berlin. And Oppenheim had basically bankrolled the whole, thing all along these many decades. And so he had founded in Berlin his own museum called the Tell Halaf Museum in Charlottenburg, which is a part of Berlin. And so that had opened in 1930. And because, and this goes right to the heart of the project that we're trying to sort of reveal and surface for the public, not only were these, various parts of the site claimed and dispersed to a host of different institutions in Europe, but Oppenheim himself personally had the authority to take 8 of them and bring them to New York to sell. It was going to be how he was going to pay himself back a little bit. He came to New York in 1930, and it was right after the stock market crash, so he was not terribly successful in getting them, in selling them. Ended up putting them back in storage, and went back to Europe. And of course, by that time in the 30s, the war was pending, so he just put them in storage for a later date to come back. He never made it back to sell them. Instead, 1943, the US had entered the war, I believe, in 1941. By 1943, the APC had done all this searching of enemy property, and Oppenheim, as a German, was of course on that list. And they discovered there were other objects as well, but we're only talking about Halaf. They discovered them in the Hahn Brothers storage and promptly seized them. And what they did is they put the APC, that is, put them up for public auction. And the Met bought them, all 8 of them. The Met then in turn immediately sold 4 of them to the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. That had all sort of been prearranged before the sale. And at the time the Met was the highest bidder, and there weren't too many bidders, and that's a whole nother story, for $4,000, sold half of them. So that's how they came into our collection in 1943. And it's important to note, by completely legal means, right? I mean, there's nothing more legal than all these governmental authorities and so forth. And the question, the big elephant in the room, without saying another word, of course, is the ethics of all this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's like sort of the heart of the conversation that we're trying to get at. And then in my opinion, I thought it was really interesting how the exhibition is situated in the ancient Near Eastern art gallery spaces. And in my opinion, I feel like it's having sort of a conversation between an ancient and modern art. I feel like at one hand, sort of Rayyane's artwork is having a dialogue with the history of these stone reliefs, but at the same time, the stone reliefs themselves are making some sort of statement on our current socio-political movements. So I was wondering what each of you thought about in terms of the temporality of this exhibition.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think, you know, it was, yeah, it's important to note that, yeah, we kind of got together first in Claire, Kim and I in around like maybe the end of 2016, the beginning of 2017. And the show opened like in October 2019. So it was really like a 2.5 year process where things also changed, including the venue of the show. So the show originally being kind of like a ancient Near East contemporary, modern contemporary collaboration, was at some point even the desire to kind of separate so that the one component of the show would be in the ancient Near East galleries, another component would be in the modern contemporary galleries. That would be kind of, that was one of the way the show would activate these different, let's say, heads of this monster, and then, you know, following different conversations and restrictions and, you know, internal politics that I'm, you know, since I don't work at the wet, I can't talk about. We ended up with this configuration where, you know, Kim was able to kind of give this rather generous and extended amount of space, which are 3 galleries, including the Court of Assyrian Relief, which we see right now, which is, you know, technically the most iconic part of the, in terms of, you know, scenography of the Department of Ancient Near East. And so it became rather important to understand the relationship that this show will have with the past, these past spaces, right? So these spaces architecturally are kind of passage spaces. They are also spaces that have, and Kim can correct me, haven't been kind of changed a lot in terms of their display since, I believe, the 80s. So an important part of this show was actually to reconsider even the objects that were already on display there. The removal of about, I think, maybe 150 to 100 objects, the cleaning of the walls, the removal of a map of the region that has been outdated and quite problematic. So a lot of the gesture of the show was an act of cleaning up in order to recognize what was the potential of these galleries that maybe had been, for lack of a better word, let's say dormant for really, for a certain period of time. Then kind of came the realization that ultimately the show was probably going to be an act of kind of a conversation across time, right? Because the show, I think, it's kind of these layers between, let's say, the legal documents, so the legal documents, which is kind of material from the archive of the Met of how the Met acquired these objects, the personal documents, which is basically paraphernalia belonging to my great-grandfather connecting him with Max, the rubbings themselves that, you know, that I made, the reliefs, the original reliefs, the kind of another piece in this show called Genealogy, which looks at this rug that had been given to my great-grandfather that he subsequently divided among his descendants. And then finally, the 6th element, which is this a seated grave figure, which is one of the most iconic pieces from the Tell Halaf site, which is kind of this rather cubist-like sculpture that had been unearthed at Tell Halaf, displayed in the main entrance of the Tell Halaf Museum in Berlin, then subsequently destroyed during World War II, during the Allies' bombing of Berlin, and then painstakingly reconstructed over the course of 10 years, and is now in, you know, let's say on long-term loan to the Pergamon Museum. And again, because the Pergamon Museum is right now under renovation, and because of the kind of close relationship between Kim and her colleagues at the Pergamon, we were able to actually secure a loan where another object from this dig would actually kind of come and be featured in this show. So you basically have 6 objects, let's say, or 6 set of objects with these very different temporalities, and that the show became, I think, ultimately a concert or a composition of how to come to terms with these different kind of timelines and how to adequately give them, let's say, each justice, but how to create a space where they could start kind of talking to each other. And that, I would say, is when a lot of these, even though the show is, let's say, it has limited elements in it, I would argue it's a highly composed show in terms of what it is that you see at what moment and where are things facing, locations, the kind of the design, the exhibition design was really important, so that it's actually quite subtle, it's quite simple, but that every single object is given, let's say, literally a platform to be on, but also space to be kind of be in conversation with the other elements.
And yeah, and I would also say on the topic of temporality, it was a very unusual condition for our ancient objects because, it's not the typical way that we show and talk about the objects that we steward, because they're really, in this exhibition, in this project, prompts for the conversation. And the exhibition, if anything, if it has a temporal focus, I would say it's the 20th century, more than the past, or, and then of course Rayyane's super current moment. But it really is the sort of, the trends and the movements and the ideologies and the events of the 20th century that toss Halaf back and forth throughout that time period. So it was a really unusual use, I would say, or deployment of our objects, of ancient objects, in that they weren't really the focus. There's briefest background, but then it's about what they prompt. So, I think, Rayyane, you often use the word props. They were almost like props, which I don't think is at all insulting in any way. And the statue that you see in the middle of the Assyrian Relief Court here, the one from Berlin, it too is absolutely there for its ancient presence, but it is also very much, the main point for us was it being there for that 1943 on our side of the ocean here in the US was alien property and the seizure of the reliefs in storage. 1943 on the European side was the full-blown war, and that object, that the museum that I spoke about, the Tell Halaf Museum, was destroyed by Allied bombings, not by the bombings themselves, but by the phosphorus bombs, and then the fire brigade coming in and the basalt being so hot that it all blew up. And that's what you're seeing here, is the painstakingly reconstructed sculpture. And it was really interesting. One of the most interesting conversations we had, the three of us, along with design and others, was how to position her. Rayyane just referred to that. And it was a completely unmet like thing to do. Not that there are two entrances, two ways of accessing this exhibition, but the main one was definitely the title wall was, on the backside of what you're seeing here on, from the viewpoint of where we're seeing her. And so to put her back first, which is the side that really shows the damage, and it's not, it reads immediately as not as damage, archaeological damage, it reads as violence, as an injury, from elsewhere. And so very importantly, it's unclear, Nadia, this is for you, it's a gender issue where the field is debating heavily as to her gender, its gender. The sculpture also is, as a secondary narrative, is also there very, very loudly asking the public, the visitor, to engage with the issues of where objects are safe, right? That's one of the great debates at the moment, has been for a decade or more, that objects are safer in the West. Are they safer in the West? She was damaged. The whole museum was blown up in Berlin, not in Syria. So that's the sort of assumption that a visitor might make. She's from Syria, probably was damaged in Syria in recent conflicts. No, not at all. And not only was the damage done in Berlin, it was done at the hands of the Allies. So, there's so many layers to this exhibition. There's the primary narrative that we, as Rayyane said, really worked hard to construct. It's very tight, but then it spills into any number of other directions. And Clare speaks very beautifully to the sort of absences and presences. And anyway, I'll stop talking and turn over to you, Clare, on the but that's the temporality for us was really interesting, a really great way to interrogate the ancient objects.
I'll just say something quickly about the temporality, which is that I think this shot is quite effective in showing you how the exhibition was composed of a series of fragments, reconstructed into this whole that never quite comes together as a resolved whole. And so if you spend a certain amount of time in the exhibition, what you start to see is the rest of the world that has been left out, and the rest of the world kind of comes rushing in those cracks and in those missing parts. Funnily enough, or strangely enough, of course, the exhibition opened in October 2019, and then it's almost like the rest of the world caught up with us, and then the museum went dark, and the exhibition went dark and became invisible, and the rest of the world and many, problems that we've seen the last year came into relief and sort of took center stage. So that's one more aspect of temporality. This show was dark for a long time, and in that period of time, we had a lot of time to think about everything that was going on, how it connected with this exhibition, and sort of when it came together again, when it was open, we regrouped and had an event called In Light of What We Know Now, sort of looking back at the show from the perspective of everything that had happened in the last year. So, yeah.
Emily, may I add one quick thing too? And just very briefly, the placement of the statue in the Assyrian Relief Court then opened up, which none of us, or I maybe who had the most information to foresee this, did not anticipate, is that there's this extraordinary dialogue between that statue from Halaf and the Assyrian reliefs for multiple reasons. The Assyrian reliefs are always considered in the Western academic canon, the sort of imperial refined gem of the field and certainly of the collection at the Met. And the works, the sculptures from Halaf, a more provincial, they're temporal, this is on the temporality, they're contemporary sites, right? But Halaf was sort of looking to Assyria for its iconography, but made a poor cousin of Assyria. And what happens with the placement of the statue in the middle of the Assyrian court is that it holds its own absolutely 1000%. And it gives everyone who's a little bit more nerdily into the ancient scholarship a chance to really evaluate that canon. And additionally, the Assyrian reliefs have their own colonial imperial story, because they were excavated in the 19th century by the British, by Layard, and they were shipped off mostly to Britain and then dispersed from there all over the world, like Tell Halaf, and also were cut up for ease of, in many cases, not every case, for ease of convenience. And in some cases, the heads of the various reliefs were cut out because it looked like European portraiture. They didn't want the whole relief, they just wanted the head. And so you can't see it in this angle. There's one on a wall that it's sort of, obfuscated here. So the stories are so they're so wonderfully in dialogue. And so this exhibition that was a whole chapter we didn't anticipate, but just really came to life once the statue was placed there.
Yeah, on the placement of the statue, I also found it really interesting how you can sort of, by looking at the cracks of the statue, your eyes sort of naturally look at like the Assyrian court, and you realize the missing pieces on the wall. And I think that sort of demystifies the idea of completeness that our cultural institutions like museums are trying to strive for. But on the note of what Claire was talking about, how the exhibition sort of opened and then COVID immediately happened and the museum had to temporarily close. I was wondering, sort of with the backdrop of COVID and some ongoing social movements, how has your perception of what this exhibition represents and mean develop after these major events, or more more that you can think of.
I mean, you know, it's in our opening, I mean, it's as if I think Claire, Kim, and I always knew that there was something in this show that was probing the institution to think beyond the safety of its own kind of presence, but I feel that maybe, and it was addressed quite directly in our, because each of us spoke at the opening in October 2019, and we each addressed maybe a moment that we felt this exhibition was probing. Then, you know, in March the museum shut down, and then following the many kind of events of 2020, suddenly the museum had to come to terms with what was happening outside of its doors. And I think that it's as if we had always, it's kind of, we had kind of planted the seed for something that was maybe either misunderstood or kind of labeled, and that suddenly kind of as the museum was kind of shut down, like this kind of seed that we planted grew, and when it reopened, they like the institution itself, but even maybe some of the public from outside had to contend with something that had already been there. And that's kind of the way that I like to work personally. I think that you know, a reflection on the past, in order for it not to be romantic, has to ultimately lead us into the present in order to question the possibilities of the future. And so I think what the show, maybe up until it shut down, had maybe taken care of the first two parts, right? Being a reflection on the past and brought that past into the present. But what happened during the closure and kind of the imminent present of the present also had us maybe forced us to address more directly what are certain aspects of this that could lead us into a conversation for the future. That was hinted at in us coming together a year after the show opened in October 2020 in this kind of virtual webinar called In Light of What We Know Now, but then to actually work on a symposium that took place a few weeks ago called White Cube, Black Box, which actually brought people from outside the institution to reflect on what it means to be an encyclopedic museum today. What are some of the concerns that, let's say, the digital brought on? So other questions that maybe the show didn't address directly while in its intention, but were, as Kim, you know, mentioned before, kind of questions around the show that we then had time to reflect back and think clearly about them. And I feel like right now we're in this moment where we're trying by bringing in conversation from the outside, by participating even in this conversation today, to imagine together what are actual actions for the future, right? So I think it also became, if we think of the exhibition not as an illustration of a thesis, but an invitation for a conversation, the events of 2020 actually forced us to have the conversation, as opposed to just say, you know, in again, a romantic way, this is an invitation for the conversation and you as the audience have to have the conversation. It actually kind of reflected back on us that it forced us to kind of maybe lead that conversation or engage more directly with it.
And if I mean, maybe this is the moment to bring it up, and Emily, tell me if it's not, but for us too, at the genesis of the exhibition in the back of my head and brain was that we in our department had been working at that point already for a couple of years and had continued while we were planning the exhibition to really get on the table at the Met this idea of, you know, what would it look like? And I'm only very clearly right now, only speaking for our department, not at all for the Met at large and not for any other department at the Met. You know, we made a very conscious decision and no one ever forced us to, but we were no longer going to acquire antiquities in our field. and for reasons that I don't need to explain to anyone in this group, I imagine. And we wanted that to be, I mean, again, no one made us, so we could have just not done it and left it there. But we really wanted to have that be a conversation. And that in turn did become a very, very robust internal conversation. We were hoping in our department to get even the slightest policy change that would signal the allowance for that. That hasn't happened yet. We're still pushing. But what this, at the time that this exhibition came about and was in process of being planned, and the conversations between the three of us were happening, it was already, because we never mentioned that in the exhibition, but it was a way of sort of introducing the historical conditions which would lead to such a conversation, right? So if you're looking just at the chronology of Halaf, and you're, you know, without any opining, without any editorializing, just what happened to this site in the course of the 20th century and 21st century, one would pause, right? One pauses. Again, all legal. You know, the Ottomans were legal, the French Mandate was a legal authority, you know, APC was a legal authority, all of it legal, but it just makes one pause. And so for myself and my colleagues in Ancient Near East, it was a really important discussion to put out there that would in turn, we hope, lead to a different kind of conversation internally, eventually externally. And indeed, no policy change yet, but you know, we are in our department, we are articulating the fact that we're not collecting. And you know, I'm aware that there's a whole nother conversation about repatriation and other things in between. But for now, that was a really important priority for us. And the other, so I would also mention, and Claire can take over from here, one of the things that it's super subtle, and maybe only the three of us understand this happened, but one of the things we did is we jointly, Modern and Contemporary and Ancient Near East, acquired Rayyane's rubbings. And that is a very important, it's not like the Met acquires, every day, all the time. But the important thing about that is that it was really the first time we had a joint acquisition. There's not even a way in our database to make it, to signal that it's a joint acquisition. It's crazy. One of us has to own it. And it also opens up a really interesting other conversation is, we were interested in this acquisition because we're not acquiring antiquities. And that is our form of like tiny little movement towards decolonizing. And for Claire and her department, the acquisition like this is an important one. They have, and I'll let you say that, Claire, but it's actually a very important way of decolonizing for them. So, the discrepancy for not acquiring and acquiring what we are acquiring and not acquiring is a conversation that isn't obvious in the exhibition, but it lays the groundwork. So very important.
Yes, exactly what Kim is saying. I mean, it's funny how these two mandates dovetail. So where you have Ancient Near East, the Department of the Ancient Near Eastern Art, effectively putting a pause on collecting, then in the Department of Modern Contemporary Art, you have this new vision for expanding the collection to include works by modern and contemporary artists from outside of Europe and the US. Those two things, it's not a coincidence that they're happening at the same time. I think, historically what has happened is that you have the Middle East is a source of, is the site of the ancient, is the site of, the non-modern, and whereas Europe and the US define modernity. So it's a really important development, I think, to say, well, actually, the Middle East is a site of modern contemporary art. We're collecting from there. And at the same time, the ancient artifacts, quote unquote, that come from this area are so embedded in the present, so implicated in what's going on, that we're gonna, take a moment to think very carefully about that and what that means for us as a museum. And so I think one of the most important things that I understood from this exhibition, and I had a lot of revelations working on this, but one of them was that all of these objects put together in the same space suddenly start to reverberate, and their typologies as objects starts to loosen a little bit and starts to circulate a little bit more. So you have things that are heirlooms, you have artifacts, ancient artifacts, you have contemporary works of art, you have documents, and suddenly the lines between all of those things become a little bit blurred. And I realized, I guess, as part of this, how important that is for, what is now referred to as decolonizing the museum. So allowing those definitions of objecthood to suddenly loosen up and become a little bit freer or more mobile within the space of the museum.
Yeah, I'd add too that, we're not usually at the Met in the habit of showing acquisition papers, documents. So that was a big deal in and of itself. And a really important, as you say, object category, Claire, in the story here, because it also attests to the legality, yet it's staring you in the face with this crazy seal of the Alien Property Custodian. And I don't know, you probably have a slide of that, maybe Claire, somewhere in there. So many subtle, and I hope not so subtle in the meantime, if enough people saw it, interventions, right?
Yeah, I think what really attracted me to this exhibition and why I engaged with it for so long is just the sheer amount of possibilities and interpretations that can generate out of this, and just evident from the number of conversations that we've been having, and also that has generated out of this exhibition, like the one you talked about, the one-year review, as well as the one that happened last month that Rayyane just talked about, White Key Black Box Symposium, that discussed the notion of a universal museum in sort of a digital age. So I was wondering for you, how has this exhibition changed your idea of what a museum is, or what direction museums should be going towards?
Do I have to answer that? It's always so fraught, right? Because one's personal thoughts and one's institutional persona. Rayyane, you get to pass because you're not a Met person. Is that what you're nodding so happily about? Yes. Claire, do we?
Okay, I'll just, yeah, sure. I think
you go first and I'll follow you.
Okay, my frantic hand gestures. I think that the exhibition is a model for, and I don't say that lightly, I mean, it's a model for interdisciplinary collaboration, interdepartmental collaboration, and also for the very fraught proposal of bringing in a contemporary artist into ancient art galleries. How does that work? I think I mentioned before how much the Middle East is sort of elided with an idea of the ancient or the past. So when you have a contemporary artist who's not European, who's not American, coming into an encyclopedic museum, my first fear was, I didn't want people to see Rayyane's work in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art and think, that there was some kind of elision of, the history that he was talking about as being somehow a non-modern history, or his work as being somehow, framed as non-modern. So I think that I really feel like that was tackled successfully, and that all of these objects are talking to each other and yet hold their own discursive spaces and visual spaces. And the other element I would say is this question of typologies, object typologies, and how do we sort of address the implicit bias that's in the hierarchy of objects that museums own and display. And I think, finally is the way in which museums open themselves up to conversations, open themselves up to the communities that come visit, that are interested in interacting. And I think partly one of the things that we got right was also the online presence for the exhibition. So Rayyane did a wonderful performance that we have both in Arabic and in English online. He also did a wonderful recitation of the index that's goes across the top of the installation of the rubbings. So it has something of a presence in both languages and online, so that people can access, what some of the ideas, and of course it's not the same as actually visiting, but it was really important to us, I think, that this piece spoke beyond the limits of the city and of New York as well.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Claire, for softening the entry for me. So for us, it's an incredibly big deal, this exhibition, because of the modern and contemporary department, for whatever crazy reason, is allowed to talk about contemporary issues. We in the ancient departments typically have not engaged, and certainly have not been encouraged to engage. So it was a critically important way for us to break that door open, that window open, and at a very important time as well, because we are like literally on the cusp. We're selecting an architect this week for a complete reimagining and rethink of our gallery space. And in that project, this alien property exhibition and narrative was a really important, for us, test of how we might construct, all narratives are constructed, how we might construct the narratives going into this new space. And, certainly we will continue to be committed to telling the ancient histories in a more traditional way. But what this exhibition did for us in our department, it just showed us so many possibilities of other ways of engaging the objects, of engaging the narratives, of engaging the histories. And that will, all of this, everything we learned will be absolutely deployed in this new project, in these new galleries. And, and in doing that, we are changing the museum. And I'm not saying that in a conceited way. This project already did that. Again, if this had happened in MNC, in modern and contemporary, that's what they do. I don't know why we're not allowed to, and everything was always, the museum, the bigger the museum, these encyclopedic universal museums have historically been so siloed, not only department by department, but just who gets to work with whom and who, it's an issue of representation anyway in art history and art, but then it's even a double whammy in the museum of who gets to represent what. So the fact that we broke down some of these silos in this project, and it wasn't like I only spoke for the ancient and Clare only for the contemporary and Rayyane only for himself. We really, I would say, I don't want to correct you, Emily, but we all three curated this show. No, Rayyane is his own artist. I can't, invade that space, but we really conceived of this very deliberately as a joint thought process. And I hope that moves a needle. It also, as I mentioned earlier, implies this other maneuver we're trying to do in our department of explaining our pause on collecting. And all of that is just, moving small needles inside the Met that are, really entrenched. We've had very entrenched, all big institutions are enormously, deeply, profoundly entrenched in their ways. So this project, combined with the events of this past year, I think have done more to create possibilities for change. I wouldn't call it change yet, but possibilities for change, than I've experienced in my many years there. And it's not validating, it's encouraging, because, you know, on some level, and the Alien Property Symposium White Cube Black Box address this. You know, there's one tact you could just say universal museums have had it, right? They're artifacts of the past themselves, and they shouldn't exist anymore. And yet they're huge platforms for change. So if we can make those changes inside the museum, and this is the tiniest first step for our department, then it's worth hanging in there. And I think that was really beautifully discussed in the symposium and all the panels. So, you know, that's what's at stake for me anyway in this project and going on beyond it.
Yeah, for sure. The exhibition is set to close in June this year, and I know that Claire. Or correct me if I'm wrong, if the date's correct.
No, late breaking news. The statue is staying. The rubbings, sorry to interrupt you, Emily, but the rubbings are going to come down because they've long exceeded their light sensitivity level allowances. But the statue is going to stay because the Germans can't leave to pick her up. So she's staying, and then the entrance, you know, the room which has genealogy and the title wall and the spy story and the other documents, the institutional documents, that's all going to stay intact, and we're going to figure out a way to sort of keep it going with a disclaimer about the rubbings. And this way we also have the web platform that stays live till the end of the year, onto which we can load up the recording of the symposium from a few weeks ago, the transcript from the symposium. So it will have a slightly different version, but it will stay up. That's hot. I didn't have time to even tell you that, sorry, but it's staying up a little bit longer in some form.
Well, I'm pleasantly surprised, but I think you sort of then just partially answered my question, but I was wondering, so, I mean, eventually the exhibition is coming down and new things are gonna roll into the Ancient Near Eastern Art Gallery spaces. I was wondering, I guess for a perspective for curator and artists, what comes after this? How are you planning on to continue the conversation? And I guess I wanna ask Rayyane this question first in terms of your artwork. How are you planning to continue this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this project is kind of one of many stories that I've followed, I think. But what I kind of learned from this, you know, again, this is a project that started in 2016, took different forms, and was presented in different institutions. So it's important to kind of note that the presentation at the Met is one of kind of many, let's say, chapters in the life of this particular body of work. But the presentation at the Met definitely kind of introduced me to this idea of kind of collaborating with it, because in many other cases, mostly contemporary art spaces, the relationship is less, let's say, a critique of the institution itself where the show is happening, and more a critique of the conditions that led to even the story that I'm kind of after happening, or the making of these objects. And so kind of in the engagement specifically with the Met was kind of coming to terms with what happens when kind of these reflections, you know, what happens to these reflections when they are enacted in the space where the critique is yeah, like what happens when the very thing you're trying to critique is the place you're showing the work in, right? And so, and not at on a let's say a basic institutional critique level, kind of a broader philosophical and conceptual kind of approach to what does it mean to present these works in those contexts. And so for me personally, it kind of solidified my kind of belief and my interest in looking at the histories of institutions that I'm invited to work in and kind of tease out from either their history, their geography, where they are located, some kind of echo that would help kind of position the work beyond its own logic, right? Beyond its own history. And what was very important until the presentation at the Met, the show or the series was led primarily by the narrative of my great-grandfather. But what's very important in its presentation at the Met is that that kind of shifted away from the personal into the institutional. And I think that shift helped the work to kind of acquire maybe a dimension beyond, you know, the personal, beyond the private. And so it's early for me to see kind of the reverberation of this kind of experience, but I already feel it in the way I think and I make work and I engage with institutions on projects. Also, not at all, because, you know, not all my work is about archaeological digs, right? So it's like, even on the, like, I'm working on a show at the Walker right now about the history of IBM, you know, as distant from as you can be from Tell Halaf, but the approach, the orchestration, the understanding of it's a form of, I would say, like maybe a new form of institutional critique, where a project doesn't from the get-go intentionally critique the structure that it's participating in, but finding, let's say, allies, you know, because there's always, you know, there's always this, I was going to add to the like museum, you know, the museums of the futures. There's now all this conversation and this buzz, you know, that we have to think of the museum as a forum, not a mausoleum, right? Like, that's a great statement, but that actually takes a lot of actual work within the institution and outside of the institution. And so from my experience, I would say moving forward is finding kind of these allies within institutions that sometimes might not be the ones you thought were kind of the allies, or like finding people that can actually enact change, even at a very small scale, that were that again were not the ones you thought were people that could enact change. So I think that's what I would kind of move forward. I've learned from this experience, and I'm moving forward with.
I guess one last question before I invite Professor Al-Ali back to ask some questions as well. But I was wondering, from a student's perspective, what actions can we take to continue the discussion in your point of views?
Well, I'll just maybe, sorry, Kim, you wanted to, from the point of modern contemporary art, I think what I've seen in the last 5 years since joining the Met has been so heartening, in that, you know, when I was in grad school, there was the field of modern contemporary art from the Middle East, from South Asia, whatever. It was really hard to find a place to go study that field and really, you know, find guidance from people and get recognized for the work. What I've seen in the last 5 years is how much that has been changing. And I think that that has to do a lot with, it's driven by people's interests. It's driven by recognition that many people, students especially, have of the, you know, the history of the modern history of the world that we've inherited, including colonialism and including imperialism and the Industrial Revolution, all of those things, bringing us to the point we are at now, where we're able to think of modern art history as a worldwide phenomenon, and something that can be legitimately studied and taught and shown in museums. And that's really been a student-powered development, I'd say. And so I think that that's key to the future. I think also having, you know, people who are invested in these institutions of art and museums, invested because they care about the work and what the museums stand for, but also want to, you know, bring change to those places that they do care about. So that's my short answer to a big question.
I mean, I would say the same. You know, for our field, it's been really hard. There's a little moment right now where there are more students going into it, but you know, so many really, you know, old famous programs in ancient Near Eastern art and art history, archaeology, have been sort of subsumed into the classics. And that's, I'm not going to get going on that. That's a problem all unto itself. And so I just, you know, I hope that Alien Property, maybe in its own little way and part, entices students to go into the field, or, you know, sort of cross-disciplinary ways into the Near East, ancient Near East, you know, maybe ancient and modern together. And it helps show that these objects are not, you know, dead in their time and place. They have so much more to say. And there are so many, you know, this is a moment, because of all that's happening, where those conversations and those objects can be brought back into a very, very contemporary discourse. And so I hope that ignites a little bit more interest, because, you know, we have really lost a lot of programs. I mean, Harvard cut out its Ancient Near East program, the IFA, the Institute of Fine Arts. I mean, Brown is wonderful. On the other hand, they've created a whole center, right? The Joukowsky Center. But it's really, it's hard. And a lot of it, I will bring in at the last hour, a critical component is funding, right? Because a lot of museums and programs are connected to the collectors that collect. And because people are finding it increasingly difficult, for good reason, to collect in our field, they're not funding those departments or those departments in museums. And so there's less visibility and less opportunity for students. And, you know, that's all part of the decolonizing conversation, obviously, is the funding, you know, sources of funding and what drives interest and what drives programming. So that's a whole nother panel.
Right, should I come in here now? I was wondering, Claire, maybe this is a good time to unshare your screen as we're starting a discussion. And anyone who would like to put in a question or a comment, I encourage you to do that via the Q&A function. So thank you very much. I mean, I've listened, you know, with great interest. And for me, as someone who, I guess, sort of similar to Rayyane, has worked in different contexts transnationally, I guess one of my questions, I mean, we spoke about temporality, but I'm interested in the transnational aspect of your work, Rayyane. I mean, so I grew up in Germany with Iraqi connections, and then I lived in London, now here, and the work that I do, I know that, you know, similar to you, I'm interested in challenging you know, prevailing narratives and try to find sort of specifics, but I am challenged when working in different contexts. And I, you know, wonder, you know, as you said, the exhibition in the Met is a chapter of this wider project that has been exhibited in different forms, in different places, different spaces. So how has it traveled? How, you know, how has the specific context and the specific stories, how, you know, I mean, have you been made aware that, you know, some things might not travel so well, or that you might have to adjust, you know, part of your message, whether it's visual or in terms of, you know, the more literal narrative around it? So yeah, I'm interested in that.
I mean, it's really interesting to think about it because, you know, like I said, this is a project that started in 2016, but from the get-go, it's not that I knew exactly what I was going to do, what were the works, the number of works. So right now, looking back, I could say, you know, Fragments is a series of like 8 large-scale installations made over the course of, you know, 3 years that have traveled in different contexts differently. But from the get-go, it was a project that was, it was a really, like, I would say, a journey, or the works were an excuse for the conversation. Like, for example, I felt like if I approached these curators in these encyclopedic museums at the Louvre, at the Met, at the Pergamon, at the Walters, and just have a conversation about my great-grandfather, that would be pretty much the end of it. I needed an excuse to kind of extend that conversation. And that's when like the rubbings became like an interesting like point of conversation, like the rubbings of the reliefs. But you know, so this is a show that, like I said, originated in 2016 in Berlin, where I did my first show at the AD Gallery in April 2017 with 3 works from the series. And then the series kind of grew. I did a large presentation of works at the Kunstverein in Hamburg. Then the show traveled to Sphere Semler Gallery in Beirut. Then part of it went to the Louvre, part of it went to the Carré d'Art in Nîmes, part of it came to the Met, and now another component of it is at the Sharjah Art Foundation in Sharjah. And in each presentation, what became really important is that this is a multifaceted story. From the get-go, I thought that there was like, this is one story, and then I had to like replicate the story in these different contexts. But soon after starting the conversations with either the institutions themselves, with the curators working there, with conservators in some cases, it became very important that there would have been a fine calibration of what was maybe the specific angle that the work would highlight in a specific context. So even though the works, let's say, themselves didn't change, so I would show the same group of works in these different contexts, the framing of the show, the language around the show changed. And that's when, and I think Clare said that in a talk we did together in Beirut with Kim and Bettina Steinbrücker from Kunstverein in Hamburg. I think it's a site-aware series that kind of, let's say, shape shifts as it grows. So for example, in Hamburg, the focus was really on the German component of the story, on the von Oppenheim family, their relationship to banking, their relationship to kind of like wealth and colonialism. The presentation in France, both at the Louvre, but more importantly at Carré d'Art in Nîmes, was really a reflection on the French mandate part of the story, the understanding of partage, the kind of the logic that led to the dissemination of the works. The presentation in Beirut was much more personal, right? It was a stage that was, we're very close to the site in Syria, but also it has to do with my own family. So kind of the personal dimension was that. The presentation at the Met, as we discussed, was very much about the legality and the kind of the ethical component around the acquisition. And the presentation right now at Sharjah really dives deep into an aspect that we didn't talk at all about today, but was the fact that, hand in hand with Max von Oppenheim doing the research on archaeology, he was also doing a big ethnographic studies on Bedouin tribes. And this is a study that was then later used by Rommel in his attack in North Africa. So the slippery slope between anthropology, ethnography, and the military. And that was kind of a big kind of, that was given center stage in the presentation in Sharjah. So I think it made me aware that not all the works vibe at the same kind of wavelength, and in different presentations you have to, let's say, foreground one work over the other.
Yes, I was kind of, of course, I didn't know all the ins and outs, but I was, wondering about that because it resonates very much, with, even, academic or activist work that, is very different. I will mainly work on women and gender in the Middle East, but clearly, what you say in terms of foregrounding, that is so important. I guess I want to sort of ask a sort of parallel question about the transnational connections to Kim and Clare. You were speaking about, the significance of the exhibition, and especially vis-a-vis, the politics of the museum, the division of labor, who is doing what, within the Met, but also, other comparable institutions. And I was wondering, what kind of conversations, if any, are taking place transnationally? Are you sort of connected to, networks of curators, art historians who are sort of invested in similar projects and are trying to break some of the boundaries. Are those boundaries maybe already much more fluid in other countries, in other contexts? Is this a very sort of US-centric discussion, or what is the scope of your, I guess, networks and the kind of context in which you operate?
I think I'll go first. I'll take a crack at that first. So I think there's, my sense when I first got to the Met was that there's a lot more dialogue already happening between institutions of contemporary art in Europe and in the Middle East. And that might have to do with proximity. It might have to do with the European Union and the sort of conceptualization of a Mediterranean sphere, culture and intellectual history. So I think that I think that seems to be shifting now, and the US and its institutions are becoming more and more invested in the rest of the world and what's happening in the art world and those places. It's at the same time, I think it's not a clear division, and that I find in my position that it's often a matter of translating between, you're speaking to very different kinds of people, of groups, and that involves a certain level of translation, of storytelling. And I think before this exhibition, I always really resisted the idea of storytelling, and it's become, because I felt like it was sort of too pat, too easy, but it's become clear to me how important storytelling is as part of this process, and that as part of every museum process, whether it's in the Middle East, in Europe, or in the US. And I think, it's dramatically different what kind of stories you're telling, depending on where you are and what kind of institutions you are in. And I hope that more and more stories will be exchanged, or people will be able to tell different kinds of stories in this place. And I think that's what I'm seeing shifting, or what I hope is happening now.
That's Claire. Kim?
So, so much to say. I mean, on the most basic level, I mean, our entire field is grappling, really, really very profoundly with the issues of our collections. And I would say that goes equally for US institutions as well as Europeans. Europeans have a very specific history. We actually, in the US, kind of use them as a model when we began our museum projects. I'm going to tread carefully for the most part. They were active participants in actual territorial colonialism. I mean, we have our colonialism, but that happened here on the U.S. soil. But in terms of Near Eastern objects, that is a very obvious history. So they're grappling in a very different way. I mean, Berlin has been incredibly, involved in a several decade deep dive into everything, and not only their colonial imperial, they have imperialism, they have colonialism, and they also have their Nazi past. So they're really trying, and they've been very open-eyed, clear-eyed, and who knows where it's going to land, especially in the Humboldt Forum. But they have been immersed for a variety of reasons. We are way behind on that on one hand, but on the other hand, we also don't have we have a different interface with these issues. And that is because most of our collections are the market, and the ones that come from excavations come from this very fraught period of partage, right, of sharing the division of finds, which again, legally acknowledged between parties, but you know, fully involved in the power dynamics of colonial mandates and, you know, in our case, the Met. So, you know, the whole field is grappling. And so in that sense, to answer your question more directly, we are very much all in contact with our colleagues in Europe. We have endless workshops and symposia and conversations. You know, they have different, on some level, European institutions are more bureaucratic. So sometimes harder, even more bureaucratic. we're plenty bureaucratic. So they have a different set of processes that they have to go through. And of course, very much directly governmental. We don't have to deal with governmental agencies so much. We have the issue, which is distinct, but just as difficult, of individuals, right? And again, that goes right back to the funding sources. And because so much of our funding comes from collectors who are sort of holding on for dear life, and museums are entangled with that funding source, it's a very slow process. But we are very much all in conversation. And the thing that the sort of irony of this past year is that we've also been able to be far more in touch with our colleagues in the Middle East than we were before. I mean, partly, of course, don't forget the, you know, the travel ban that made it impossible, you know, and the endless conflicts. It was impossible for us to go there as we had traditionally, you know, for especially, you know, obviously Iraq and Syria and Iran for a long time. And you know, thanks to Trump, impossible for them to come here. So the Zoom culture has allowed us to be very much in touch. So we're having a moment of incredible connectivity and discussions. And that's really important, especially the ability to bring in our Middle Eastern colleagues, because that's where the trust needs to be repaired, and they need to be at the table. You know, this is an issue of parity, of trust. And it's, again, it doesn't even necessarily lead to repatriation or any major changes. It's the conversation. We've brought that up so many times this afternoon. It's the conversation that's critical and key.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of have tried to follow, especially the discussions in Iraq closely, and you know, also of course with the theft of so many Iraqi artifacts, which is still an ongoing issue. So as we're running out of time, I'm going to hand over to Emily if she wants to say a few last words. But for me, I just want to thank you all. This was incredibly interesting and exciting discussion, and it also feeds, of course, into many broader discussions we've been having at Brown, especially actually led by students who are very much interested in decolonizing the curriculum in the widest sense. And so this is, I think, a really great, interesting example of how it sort of plays out in a very specific context. So I'm really grateful to you all. I'm very grateful to Emily for really having conceived of all this. And of course, you know, we will make the recording available, and so that will be quite useful, and we'll share it with you. Emily, would you like to say a few words towards it?
I just wanted to echo exactly what everything Professor Ali had said. And again, thank you all three so much, and the Center of Middle East Studies for supporting this, and really wanting to also continue the same conversation as I do. And as Professor Ali said, there has been a lot of movements around campus regarding decolonization in various aspects. And I thought it would just be really interesting to get a perspective from institutions, from artists on sort of what this means. And the more perspectives that we can bring in, I think the more common understanding we have, the better we can move towards a common goal. But yeah, that's all I had to say. Thank you all again for coming.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Pleasure.